Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors, all you citizens of the world, welcome to another edition of the Live from the Heartland show. From Chicago, I'm Michael James, and today I am not going to do any opening banter. We've got one guest, a guy that's very deserving of all the attention he's going to get. He's been a guest on our show many times over, the one and only Rus Bradburd. And Rus Bradburd is a real Chicago hero in many ways. He came out of South Shore, went to Amundsen High School, then he went to North Park College. He was part of a championship basketball team. His great skill is dribbling. He became a recruiter and an evaluator of basketball talent, went on to become an assistant coach with the famed Haskins at UTEP and Henson at New Mexico State. And he is the founder of Basketball in the Barrio, and he is an author. And the reason that he is coming to town is he has a new book out called Big Time, and it's his first novel. His other books include Patty on the Hardwood, which I had an honor of taking some photographs that got used. Rus was coaching professional basketball in Ireland. And I took my wife, Paige, on a honeymoon there. I said, do you want to go to Iowa or do you want to go to Ireland? She said, let's go to Ireland. Little did she know that we would be running around all of Ireland watching Rus and his team play basketball. Anyhow, Rus is coming to town to do a couple of readings for his new book, so we're going to talk about it. So with all that blah, 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 Rus, how about saying good morning to each other? Hi there.
Hi, Mike. It's great to be back. There were some exaggerations in my bio there, which I won't quibble about, but I went to Von Steuben High School.
I apologize.
I wouldn't want to offend the Amundsen people or the Von Steuben people. But anyway, yes, it's great. It's great to be back. I still miss the pancakes and the great breakfast at the Heartland. It was my favorite restaurant in town, but it's good that we're keeping it alive this way.
Yeah. The way I met Rus was, I don't even remember meeting you, Rus. I just remember that you wrote for the Heartland Journal.
It was through Righteous Bob Rudnick.
Who was the Minister of Culture or something for the White Panther Party and one of the first FM DJs.
Yes, he suggested he was my brother's roommate, and he suggested, if you want to be a writer, you should look at the Heartland Journal, and maybe you could write something for them. And so that was how we originally met, was through Rudnick, who was sort of one of the real sort of cult legendary sort of guys.
Bob Rudnick, he was something in the White Panther Party. Well, Rus, we're going to devote both segments of this show to you. And so I think on the first half, we're going to talk about your new book and the dates that just so people know where they can really see you in person, get signed copies, buy a copy of the book, will be two events. One of them is going to be at the Book Cellar on December 6th. That's on Lincoln Avenue, 4736. And then you're going to do an event at Seminary Co-op along with our friend Bill Ayers. That's at 5751 South Woodlawn, and that will be on Wednesday, the 11th. So you're coming to town. You got a new book. Let's talk about the book. This is your first novel. Give it to us, Rus. What do you got to tell us?
Well, I as someone who coached in college basketball for 14 years, and then I was a professor on the academic side of things. I was a professor in the English department for 16 years. And so I saw this stark contrast between the way athletics is run and the way academics sort of function. And it was quite a shock to me to sort of see how paralyzed the academic side of the world is. And I just found it strange that especially at our big state universities, it's not happening at your Lake Forest College or my North Park College, but at the big state universities, at the University of Illinois and University of Wisconsin, the football coaches and the basketball coaches are making a ton of money. And now with the NIL, which in general I was in favor of, the name, image, and likeness, you could the players are getting paid. And in general, I was in favor of that. But it's just that what it's caused is that sports is more important on campus than academia. And so what I wanted to sort of write a book that was a critique of that, but I felt like the best way to do it was through a novel and through humor. I've gotten, Mike, you might not agree with this, but I've gotten where, I listen to a little NPR every day and I read the New York Times every day. But I think that Stephen Colbert is actually a better news source than NPR. And I think John Oliver is a better news source than the New York Times. I just think that through humor, particularly through fiction, I think you can get at things. In my view, the greatest book about the Great Depression ever written was The Grapes of Wrath. And it's a novel. It's not a true story. It's a novel. And I'd say the same. So I think fiction can get at things, and humor. Through humor, we can expose things that problems in the world can be exposed through humor. And so again, I find Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart to be very valuable guys.
Well, I like the idea of the humor. I've had a lot of laughs with you, but I didn't ever consider you the funniest guy on the planet. And I knew that this book was coming. You wrote it. It's been a while and you were shopping it around. Your other books are very serious. The first one, Paddy on the Hardwood, is about your experience as a coach in Ireland and learning to play the fiddle with the great Paddy Jones. Then you did a book called 40 Minutes of Hell about Nolan Richardson. And that, the great coach out of Segundo Barrio in El Paso, who was at Arkansas. And then your next book was really a very serious book about death in basketball on the West Side called All the Dreams We've Dreamed. Then all of a sudden you come up with this really funny book, and it is actually very funny.
Yeah, the last book was about gun violence in the world of Chicago basketball. So this was quite a leap for me. But I think part of it is, as on the academic side of things, I was going to these faculty meetings and just, I would come out of the faculty meetings wanting to beat my head against the wall. They seemed to be very sort of incestuous, and they were arguing about the smallest things. And what I see happening at American universities is that as football and basketball keep expanding, academics is shrinking, but everyone's afraid to stand up and say something about it. And so, for example, in Illinois, in your state, Mike, in my former state, in Illinois, a couple of years ago, the highest paid state employee was Lovie Smith. But he wasn't even the football coach anymore at Illinois. He'd been fired, but he was still the highest paid person in the state. And I think, it's taxpayers' dollars, and it's the focus and the emphasis is going toward sports. And I just felt like that had to be addressed, that it had to be brought up. But what I found on the academic side of things, so I'm lampooning the encroachment of football and basketball at our American universities, but I'm also lampooning the paralysis and sort of the impotence of the academics and the administrators, where this stuff is going on, but no one seems to. It never gets brought up at meetings. No one talks about it anymore. It's now an accepted part of life, and I think that your listeners will understand that as bad behavior and bad policy happens or happens over and over again, we get immune to it. And so without bringing up names, it just seems like, that there's outrageous behavior or bad decisions get sort of normalized with repetition. And now football and basketball have been kings on our big school campuses for so long that no one talks about it anymore.
Yeah, and then we've started to talk about the naming, image, and likeness, but there's also the athletic portal, where people can switch universities and go wherever they want. And on our show last week, my cousin Adam James, who had played football at Northwestern, he commented on that situation with the portal and really defended it for the right of people to get paid and to move around. And I think we're probably in agreement with that, but the ramifications of it are something else. They kind of fan the flames of what you're talking about, of an enhancement of athletics on campus and the diminishment of the role of academics.
Yeah, I would have a little bit of an asterisk to imagine what I missed that show, and I'll have to go back and look. But I would say in general, if the coaches can switch schools left and right, maybe the players ought to be allowed to. But my idea is it's not good for the kids to switch schools every year. We have players on our team at New Mexico State who we are their fourth university or fourth college anyway. And so I don't think that's healthy for kids. And I think the solution to that is right before I started coaching in the 1980s, they used to have a 4-year scholarship. If you signed at Northwestern, you got a 4-year scholarship. And even if you got hurt, that scholarship was honored, unless you decided to transfer to Northern Illinois or something like that. Well, my idea is if we're going to pay the players, let's do it in a 4-year. Let's offer the kids a 4-year deal where maybe they'd make $100,000 over a 4-year period or whatever it is. But I've heard a lot of fans complaining about the transfer portal where now it means kids can switch schools immediately, be immediately eligible somewhere else. And it's become difficult to follow college sports because of all the changing. And it's difficult for the fans that are in the stands thinking, now, who's this new guy? What happened to the guy we had last year? But my solution to that would be, it seems like a more sane system would be, give the kids a 4-year deal like we did in the old days. Room, board, tuition, and books was a 4-year deal up until the early 1980s.
Well, I want to go to the book, Big Time.
Oh, good.
And I'm a little bit, I think a lot of people who listen to this show are not big sports fans. There are some that are. I always like progressives who also like sports. And I'm wondering why someone should read this book if they're not a sports fan.
Well, first, it's more of an anti-sports book than it is a sports book. No one would read this book. I don't think anyone would read Big Time and say, "What a great system we have." Just the same way. Not to compare myself with Joe Heller or with Catch-22, but I don't think that anyone would read Catch-22 and say, "Let's join the Army." It seems like a well-run program. And so, in this case, it's more of an anti-sports book. There's only two. I think there's 2 pages total of actual sports in the book. It's more the personalities. And so the premise is that this university is in trouble. I imagine it's in Colorado.
It's called Coors State, just so everyone knows.
Yeah. So there's a university in trouble, and they take $1 billion buyout from Coors and to rebrand as Coors State University. But it becomes clear that the Coors insists that all the money goes to football and basketball. And so the president, thinking this is the way of the future, decides that all the money is going to go to football and basketball. And the faculty, half of the faculty quits, but the faculty that remains, they have to work for football and basketball in order to survive. And so what happens next is the English department gets tasked with writing the programs, the game programs. The math department does statistical analysis for the teams. Women's studies does the players' laundry. The business department does the investments for the players. But these 2 old history professors that, like us, Michael James, loved the 1960s, they decide enough is enough. We're going to protest, and we're going to lead these campus protests to take our university back. And so that's sort of how the novel begins, is these 2 old history professors that are selling popcorn at the football game decide enough is enough. We're going to protest like they did in the 1960s.
Well, do you have any people in real life people that come to mind when you develop these characters? Like one of the characters I loved was I think he's Polish lineman who loves poetry. Where'd you come up with it?
Well, I should say, Mike, the original, sort of one of the original triggers for the book, the impetus for writing this book it's a Chicago story. In 1936, University of Chicago was in the Big Ten Conference, if you can imagine. They would play Illinois and Michigan. And in 1936, they had the first Heisman Trophy winner. The National Football Player of the Year is called the Heisman Trophy. Jay Berwanger won the Heisman Trophy. He was a University of Chicago player. They had the famous coach, of course, and I think your father knew Amos Alonzo Stagg.
Yeah, my dad played, I think, freshman ball under Alonzo Stagg.
Okay.
And also loved Maynard Hutchins. He thought he was a great person.
Yes. Well, so Robert Maynard Hutchins was the president at that time, and he decided that football had too big of a role at the university, that it was corrupting the mission of the University of Chicago, and they dropped football. It seemed like now it seems like a completely crazy thing to do, but he did it in 1939, 3 years after they had the Heisman Trophy winner. They dropped football in the University of Chicago. They now play Division III football, non-scholarship, and it's much more in perspective. But that was the original. When I heard that story from, I don't know if you've met Mike McGrath. He's the University of Chicago basketball coach, but he told me that story many years ago, and I'd never heard that story. But that was the original. So when you say what was it based on, but the two professors in the book, the two history professors that decide to take their university back, one is sort of a loudmouth, obnoxious, we're going to burn this son of a bitch down. And the other one is a very work within this. His name is Peter Braverman. And the work within the system guy is Eugene Mooney. Like, if we just be calm, and if we work, we can change the system from within. And I think they're sort of both based on me. There's times when I think we got to burn this thing down. And there's other times when I think, if we just be patient. And I think that's always, one of the things I think that the novel does, that Big Time does, it pokes fun at this phenomenon on the left where there's a split. Like the Bernie Sanders people are angry at the Elizabeth Warren people, who are angry at the Joe Biden people. And then there's a split, and I'm not going to vote because they're. And so I think the left does a lot more of sort of this purity test where you have to be in lockstep in every, like if you're in lockstep on everything, but you're hard line on immigration, there the left can, I think, can sometimes turn on you. I think with the right, there's a lot more of a. Well, I remember a woman saying to me many years ago that I think she assumed I was a Republican, and she said, "We just have to." This is 8 years ago or whatever it was. We just have to hold our nose and vote for Donald Trump. And I think that hold our nose and vote is a much less common on the left. And so part of what I'm up to in the book is, there's a famous James Baldwin quote that he said, "Because I love something," I'm going to ruin James Baldwin's quote, but here goes, something like, because I love America so much, I insist on perpetually having the right to criticize her. And I would say the same thing for me is because I love the left and I love college sports, I insist on and I love teaching, and I love books, and I love universities. But because I love them, those three things so much, I insist on the right of making fun of them in this case. So I think in some ways, to me, there's an endless amount of comedy that comes out of Donald Trump, but I think to me, it seemed more work against the grain to make fun of the American left in some way. So I'm poking fun at the left and the way they fracture and the sort of the dreamy way they go about trying to change the world. And I'm one of them.
Yeah, you are. And I just want to read the quote from Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was the president of the University of Chicago from 1929 to 1945. And actually, my dad would have been there, I think, in 29. And the quote is, "When I feel like exercising, I just lie down until the feeling goes away." And, my last football game at Lake Forest in 1963 in the fall was against University of Chicago, who were bringing back football for Division III. It was still.
I didn't know. That's when they brought it back. I didn't know that. Yeah, but Robert Maynard Hutchins must have had quite a sense of humor, and he was very young when he started off as the president at University of Chicago. And I imagine that he felt like, I'm not sure, but I'll bet he didn't think that he was going to be the only one to do it. I think my guess is he thought this would start sort of this avalanche of things change, but instead, of course, the avalanche has gone the other way. And I don't think the idea of a university renaming after a beer conglomerate is so far from our future. It won't shock me if a university in trouble. I think it's happened in Idaho. There was I think the College of Idaho is now Albertson College, and Albertsons is the big food conglomerate here in the west of the Mississippi. But yeah, I think that the University of Chicago was the model, but most of the other people in the book are just sort of like any book of fiction. There's part this person and part that person, but it's a conglomeration of people and incidents that have happened, and just me, making stuff up.
Rus Bradburd, talk a little bit about the journey to get this published, because I know you worked on it a while, and then you've had a lot of people who've read it and have issued quotes and praise for the book. How about a little bit of the process to get it published, finally getting it published, and what people are saying about it?
Well, I think, because, University of Colorado is in the headlines now for the way their football team has taken over the campus, and with prime time, they called Coach Deion Sanders prime time. And they say that he's completely underpaid. He's making $5 million a year, and they're going to give him a huge raise, I guess. But so the timing of it seems perfect for me, but I was in a bit of a hurry to get it out. I started writing it 12 years ago, and then I got distracted by the gun violence book. But it took me 8 or 9 years to finish this book. And your listeners who have read my books before, Michael, will attest that I'm not a great writer, but I have good ideas for books, I think. And I think this is a good idea for a book. One of my many faults as a writer is I send out my manuscript too soon. So if there's young writers listening or aspiring writers, like I'm still a young writer, although I'm 65, but if there's people listening, don't send your book out too soon. And I constantly do that. And so I think it was, but I'm happy to be with the Etruscan Press. Etruscan Press is a smaller press, and it took years to sort of find the right match for this book. Etruscan Press, you would be very interested in this, Mike. Their most recent book before mine was called American Mother. And it's the story of Diane Foley, whose son was beheaded on YouTube, if you remember that horrible incident. He was the journalist that had worked for the Washington Post at one time, I think, but he was beheaded on YouTube. And Diane Foley, in the book American Mother, which is from Etruscan Press, like my book, she goes to the maximum security prison to meet one of their son's killers. Can you imagine? So it's a really devastatingly powerful book. And then here comes my book, Big Time, which is funny, and it's an important issue, but it's not anywhere near as deadly serious as Diane. Diane Foley wrote it with Colin McCann, the great Irish writer. So finding Etruscan Press was it's hard to get a book published. And if you don't get published by one of the big New York companies, now you're sort of on your own. Agents don't want to mess around with, Etruscan. If there's not going to be a huge advance, the agents don't want to be involved. But I never gave up hope in that. I knew it was a good idea for a book. I knew it was a good story. I thought it was funny. I remember my wife, Connie, calling out from the other room at the time saying, "I can hear you laughing in there." I would be laughing as I was typing it. I did get a chuckle out of writing this book, and I do think it's a funny book. But yeah, so it's getting published is a struggle, as your daughter Casey could attest.
Yeah. Well, we got a couple minutes left in the first segment here, and I wanted to bring up, there is one real person in the book that you refer to, and he's a friend of both yours and mine. It's Mark Rudd. You want to tell the readers real briefly how he figures in?
Well, one of the professors that wants to lead the protests on campus is Peter Braverman. And he's this hardcore radical. We're going to burn this place down. And he's always bragging about his bona fides, that he was a real radical in Berkeley, and that he knew Mark Rudd and he was very influenced by Mark Rudd. And that he's, smoked dope with Mark Rudd and that kind of thing. And Mark Rudd, of course, was a real life person who was in the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, and then helped found the Weather Underground with Bill Ayers, who's going to be at my event in Hyde Park on December 11th. But it turns out, I don't want to spoil it too much for the readers, but it turns out that Peter Braverman is making a lot of it up, and that he and Rudd were not really close, but he idolized Mark Rudd during his radical years and sort of leans on, he's sort of Braverman's a bit of a wannabe and a name dropper. So he's constantly dropping Mark Rudd's name, especially in the early parts of the novel. But I mentioned it. I think Rudd is, of course, was a national figure at one time and was leading campus protests, which are a big part. The campus protests are a big part of the novel Big Time, but they're also, by chance, they're a big issue on American college campuses today. Not because of college football, like in my book, but because of Palestine and that kind of thing.
No, they've cut in. There's some headlines today about how universities in the New York Times about cracking down on more campus protests. Give us a little rundown on your books, Russ. How about Patty on the Hardwood?
Well, my first book, which the Heartland Cafe had some great events for. It was Patty on the Hardwood is a memoir about me learning the Irish fiddle while I was coaching my basketball team into last place in Ireland. And so while I was trying to learn the Irish tradition of fiddling, I was trying to teach the American tradition of basketball. And And that, I don't know that we talked about how serious my books were before. That one's sort of whimsical. It's not a funny book exactly, but it's whimsical. And anyway, that was my first book. My second book was the biography of Nolan Richardson called 40 Minutes of Hell. And Nolan Richardson, he's still alive, but he was an extremely outspoken African-American coach that pointed out injustice whenever he saw it. But he grew up in El Paso as a Spanish speaker. And so he was speaking Spanish from the time he was 2 or 3 years old, went to the nearly all Mexican-American Bowie High School in El Paso, and went on to win an NCAA championship and that kind of thing. So that book, 40 Minutes of Hell, is a look at Nolan Richardson's life, but also sort of the civil rights movement seen through Black American coaches. Next, let me think now. Next was Make It Take It, a book of short stories from Cinco.
I forgot to list that. I didn't remember the name, but that's fiction, right?
Yeah, it's a book of short stories, kind of a connected short story, kind of a novel in stories called Make It Take It, that's set at a fictional university. Not as funny it's not a funny book at all. It's not at Coors State University. And then the one most recent is The Gun Violence Until Big Time, just came out this week, but All the Dreams We've Dreamed is the story of hoops and handguns on Chicago's West Side. It all happens at Marshall High School. It's a true story of Sean Harrington, the basketball coach that was shot at 7 a.m. driving his daughter to school. He dove on top of her he was in a rental car, and these young men ran up to his car. It was a total case of mistaken identity. They wound up, they shot at him. He dove on top of his daughter, and a bullet went through her headrest. So he undoubtedly saved his daughter's life. And then he took a bullet in the back, and he'll never walk again. And so that's actually how the book starts. And it only gets worse from there, Mike, because several of his players, a half dozen of his players were shot and shot and killed. But the uplifting thing about All the Dreams We've Dreamed is Sean Harrington's remarkable endurance and courage in the face. So there's the one example of courage of him diving on top of his daughter to save her life, but also I think courage can be a one-time event, but also it can be a sort of endurance. And Sean Harrington, as you know, you've met him several times, and some of your photos are in that book, I think, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
and thank you for letting me contribute my photos.
Yes.
But how about filling us a little bit in on the West Side and what's going on? Because after you wrote it, there were even more deaths. And at one point, there was a belief that the gangbangers or whoever was doing the shooting were not going after basketball players. But that shifted. And what's the story behind that?
Well, a number of things, and the book talks about it. And I'm no expert. I know that, Mike, there's people who've spent, the people from Ceasefire and Chicago Cred and Stop the Violence and Cure Violence. These people have worked all their life, worked for years trying to stop the gun violence in Chicago. So I'm no expert, but it seems what I uncovered was there was a few factors. One is the Chicago Police Department went from 5 districts to 3, and so people were getting reassigned that didn't know the violent district that they were moving into. There's the closing of 50 schools by Rahm Emanuel that damaged the neighborhoods. There's the fracturing of the gangs. That when it's like what we did in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein's not a good guy. We go after Saddam Hussein under false pretenses, and Iraq is more of a mess now than it's ever been. And I think the same has happened in the Chicago drug trade, where they went after the big boys and the gangs became fractured. And now instead of 3 or 4 main gangs, there's dozens and dozens of these gangs, and that and also there was an etiquette before. I don't know if etiquette's the right word, but there was an etiquette and a code of conduct before that certain people were off limits, and basketball players were at one time were the people that were off limits. But now that has all greatly changed, of course, where and everyone can now be a target, and things are a little bit out of control. And there's the preponderance of guns, where it's easier to get guns than it's ever been. Although people say, well, Chicago has strict gun laws, but if they're coming from Gary, Indiana, which is just right on the border anyway, it doesn't matter how strict Chicago's laws are. So it was a sort of a confluence of events. I will say, Mike, that I sort of started, like a lot of people on the left, I sort of started off thinking, what bastards the cops were. But the book actually made me much more sympathetic to what these guys go through when they're 16-year-olds driving around on the West Side with pistols in their belts. What is it? What is it that how is it? I think being a policeman in Chicago is an incredibly difficult job. And so I became much more sympathetic. I became sympathetic to what everyone is going through. And while you've helped me to work hard on getting Sean Harrington back on his feet. Sean Harrington now, since the book came out, he now has his own apartment that's ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. It's ADA accessible. But he had an army of supporters and friends, and he was a very well-loved guy. There's a lot of other victims of gun violence that do not have the support that Sean Harrington had. And so I think, we worked hard to help Sean Harrington, but now what are we going to do with the other, 40,000 gun violence survivors? I don't know.
On the police, I've always been someone who, I've had certainly my opposition time to the police, but I also have a lot of respect for a number of police officers. And we do need a police force in society. So we have to keep up our efforts to improve it and make, them accountable when need to be, and praise them when that's also necessary.
Yeah, they were heroic in finding Sean shooters, and both of the guys who shot Sean, I think they got 52 years. I think they got a 57-year sentence, and they'll have to do 50 years, which is quite a sentence for someone not dying. But they were mostly heroic in helping Harrington, and they gave me great insights. The 2 or 3 police officers that I talked to at length, I was just very impressed with their compassion and how much they ache when they see kids shooting each other and that kind of thing. So I do think it's a difficult job, and I've gotten where I think they're an easy target to say, that. And I do think, like, I was delighted when Derek Chauvin went to jail for a long time, but they're not all Derek Chauvin by any means.
Russ, I think we've covered all your books, not all the articles you've written for various people, but how about talking a little bit about your newest book, In the Works? Because I know you spend your time, you're kind of a lucky guy, you and your family, between Las Cruces, Chicago, and Ireland. And I know you've been over in Ireland a little bit in the last year working on a new book. How about filling us in on that? I know you were on the show once before and gave us a hint, but people probably don't remember that if they even heard it.
Yeah, well, the new book I'm working on, it's a nonfiction book that happens in Belfast. It's called Almost Like Belonging. And there's a phenomenon in Belfast now, Michael, where Northern Ireland has 4%. Northern Ireland, of course, is different than Ireland. It's on the same island, but it's part of the UK. And there was the terrible violence of the Catholics and Protestants shooting each other until the Good Friday Agreement went through in 1998. But since that time, Northern Ireland has 4% of the population of the United Kingdom, but they get 20% of the immigrants. So most people in Belfast that I know think that's a positive thing. They're getting an onslaught of immigrants, and these immigrants are in order to help their kids assimilate, the Syrian and Ukrainian and Sudanese immigrants are sticking their children into Gaelic football, Gaelic sports, which is an odd sort of rugby, soccer kind of, it's an odd sport. It's an odd and beautiful sport. It's a great game. But you look at these rosters of the teams, and there'll be, Kieran O'Reilly and, Sean Kelly and Muhammad Akbar. How did that kid get on the team? And there's this strange phenomenon. Well, in our experience, I think I can speak for you on this, is that sports has always been a great equalizer and a great bridge. And it's always at the forefront of social change in America, particularly in terms of race. If you think of Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali, but even Billie Jean King and Megan Rapinoe and those kinds of things, it's often in terms of gender and race at the forefront of social change. Well, that's happening in Belfast now, too, where these children are assimilating through Gaelic football. So I went over there on a Fulbright fellowship in order to write about this. But the thing that I didn't know until I got there, I thought I sort of had a good grip on the story. But what I did not understand before I got there is that many of the people running these clubs or helping the immigrants are people that were either involved in the violence before or were badly damaged in what they call the Troubles, the Catholic Protestant feuds that were going on in Belfast for many years. And so what I have found is that, like, one of the main characters in the book, he's the president of a youth Gaelic football club, and he did a life sentence for murder. Now, in America, if you tried to be a Little League baseball coach tomorrow, Michael, they would do a background check on you. And if you got a DWI or, if you had a shoplifting charge or whatever, they might stop you from, coaching Little League baseball. But here, there's people involved in these clubs that were deeply involved in the violence, and in many cases, just deeply affected by the violence. And so the sort of the theory behind the book, this almost like belonging, that has not been published yet. So if there's any publishers listening, but it has not been published yet. But the theory behind the book is that through these individual stories, that people who have been through these tragedies in war are more empathetic to other people who have gone through these. So do you remember a couple of years ago, you know Alex Kotlowitz's books, I'm sure. A couple of years ago, he had a book called American Summer, a gun violence book. And it came out around the time my Sean Harrington book did, my book, All the Dreams We've Dreamed. I'll admit Kotlowitz's book is a much better book than mine. He's a terrific writer. But in his book, it was a model for what I'm working on now in Belfast. Is each chapter worked as sort of a separate magazine piece, in my view, that through telling a dozen stories, he was able to sort of weave this narrative, a greater overview of Chicago gun violence. It's called American Summer, and it's a tremendous book. It's not as famous as his There Are No Children Here, but it's a great book, American Summer. And he did sort of this collage and braided these stories together. So that's what I'm trying to do with this Belfast book. But I'm under the same, I still have the same problems, Michael, that I have with every book. Is I get very antsy about, I've got to send this thing out. And I had looked for an Irish publisher. There's only a half dozen publishers in Ireland because it's such a small country. And now I wonder if I should be looking for an American publisher, because it's a bigger story. It seems to me to be a story about how assimilation and how immigration can be a hugely important thing. And now with immigration and refugees being such a hot button topic, it seems that Belfast was the model for peace. What's happening in Palestine, they're looking at Belfast now to think, how can we solve the violence the way they did in Belfast in 1998? Well, Belfast has also been a leader now in how sports can help children to assimilate. And so I do think that the great bridges from society to society are often sport or music, like with the Irish music in Ireland, are also food. When I was a kid, I'm sure you're the same way, is what I knew about Korean people would fit into a thimble, but it's through that restaurant, that I start loving Korean food, or that I didn't know anything about Greece, but my father took us to Greek restaurants a couple of times a year. It got me very interested in. So I think through food and music and culture, they're all often these bridges to understanding.
Russ, you bringing up Gaelic sports and Gaelic football. Who was the name of the guy, Kieran, who was on your basketball team when you did Kieran. Win the Irish championship?
Yeah.
I think you were in last place.
Yeah, Kieran Donaghy. And would you believe, Mike, he's retired from football now, but at age 42, he's still playing basketball at the highest level. He's a really remarkable person. When I met him, he was working as a part-time plumber, and I think in a restaurant, and you were worried about him showing up at practice and being in the games as we went around Ireland for the championship. But now he became the preeminent guy in Gaelic football. Yeah, he was National Sportsman of the Year after our basketball book came out. He's a star in Gaelic football and basketball in Ireland. But interesting, Mike, it's funny. I'm glad you brought him up. I forgot about this. The book talks about this at the beginning of the book. The reason I got the idea for this book is he told me about a guy. He said, you got to write an article about Stephen O'Cumber on the County Kerry Gaelic football team. And I said, well, I don't know anything about Gaelic football. Why would I care about O'Cumber? And, in Ireland, every name seems like starts with an O apostrophe. There's O'Kelly and O'Donoghue. But it turned out O'Cumber he has an African father and a Moldovan mother. And he's playing Gaelic football at the highest level. And Donaghy thought this is an interesting phenomenon. kids that are not Irish backgrounds are now starting to become Gaelic football players. So that was the original trigger for me thinking about this idea of sports as a bridge, even in Ireland. It was through this Stephen O'Cumber, who's a dark-skinned Gaelic football star. He's been injured the last couple of years, but that idea of and so as I started looking into it, it turned out there's a town in Ireland where the entire Gaelic football club is made up of Polish kids. And it was the Polish kids keeping the Gaelic football alive. They were the immigrant children. And so I do think Belfast was a model for, it wasn't perfect, the Good Friday Agreement, but it's the model for the free world. The Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, they all wish they had the Good Friday Agreement that Belfast has. And I think in another way, Belfast is sort of this model for moving forward. So after this dark book about gun violence in Chicago, and now we've got the satire big time, then I'm hoping that this next one, and I don't know, Mike, I thought I would have no trouble publishing it, but it's always a struggle to get published.
Well, I should come over there with you next time and take some pictures.
I would be delighted.
I would look. One of the things that I want to touch on, and we've done it over the years with you, because I've been involved since, I think, 2002 with Basketball in the Barrio, and it's a program that you started probably when you were still an assistant coach at UTEP. But it's a good story, and it's a wonderful organization. Originally, I was involved with Athletes United for Peace, as were you, and we all hooked up around that. Progressive athletes around the country doing various programs to try to serve the people in one way or another. Give our listeners and viewers a little bit on Basketball in the Barrio.
Well, next year will be our 33rd year of Basketball in the Barrio. We charge $1 for the kids, and they get a book and a T-shirt and a harmonica. And last year they got a chess set. We're teaching them how to play chess, but it just uses basketball. It's only 100 yards from the Mexican border. It uses basketball as a sort of a pride in Hispanic culture and pride in border culture. And we've had Arnie Duncan there, the U.S. Secretary of Education, John Carlos, the Olympic hero, Babito Garcia, the Hispanic announcer. Beto O'Rourke has been a coach at it. But Mike, I'm starting to think like I'm like Joe Biden. I've been there. I've been doing this for so long. I probably ought to retire. People probably wishing I would retire. It's gone over my head. I'm probably staying too long, but I keep doing it out of pride and joy. I love the camp, and our partner in this, Steve. Yeah, you've been the official camp photographer for many years, but our partner in this is Steve Yellen, who helped me found the camp and gets the sponsorships and that kind of thing. But it's a chance to, it's not good basketball players. None of them are going to go to the NBA, but it's a chance to affect kids' lives and make them feel special and expose them to art and music and dance and educational things. It's only maybe a third of the camp is actually basketball. I always feel like if someone were to sue us, they could get their $1 back pretty easily. But I hope you'll come again next year and take photos. And it's in the heat of the summer. It's Father's Day weekend, and I think it was 102 every day last summer. So it can be pretty hot. But we're looking. It's our 33rd year next year, and again, I'm the Joe Biden of Basketball in the Barrio.
Well, it's a wonderful program, and I keep thinking of ways to contribute to it more. Like I've suggested, maybe our fellow sports reporter on this show, my cousin Adam, might be a good person there. My granddaughter comes to camp. Maybe her mom, who teaches theater at DePaul, could come. Whatever. In any event, I'm coming again. I've been there every year except for 2 in the last 22 years. And we have only about probably 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you, a man who crosses borders, not only from state to state, but from the United States to Mexico and all the way over to Ireland. What's life on the border like right now? We hear a lot about the border. The border and immigration got used as a kind of a weapon against the Democrats. And seriously, it's not as bad as it was at one time. There are a lot of good things going on. Fill us in with what you got on it.
Well, it would just be what my own eyes tell me. I'd be no expert. And I will preface this part by saying there's people who have studied the border and immigration for many years, and it's not me. But I did notice, during the last 4 years where, I was going out east as my parents were sort of fading away, was going every month. And I did see there are a lot of people at the El Paso airport, families sitting with their backs to the wall, looking at phones with backpacks and waiting for their flights. And it did seem like things had changed a great deal. But also, I think one of the things that's changed, Michael, is that I just think the narrative has changed in some ways. This would it would surprise me to remember this when someone reminded me of this the other day, is that George W. Bush was big on immigration. Let's get more immigrants in here. We need more immigrants. It's good for the economy. And that was a big Republican talking point when George W. Bush ran. And now everything is switched, the other way. And so I do think there's times when political parties obviously can completely switch their narrative and their stance and change, and which of course the Democrats are welcome to do as well. But I would say, in some ways, I'm the wrong person to ask, in that Las Cruces doesn't seem any different to me. The town has always been about half, Spanish speaking. El Paso, of course, is maybe 80% Hispanic. So I don't think things have changed that much. One of the things that surprised me was on the Ezra Klein show. I don't know if you listen to Ezra Klein ever. He's the New York Times. I find him to be very measured and interesting. And he interviewed someone that said that something like 60% of Hispanics and African Americans think we do need to close the border. And that really surprised me. And so it seems like it's something that America is grappling with. The one thing that gets talked about all the time down here is there hasn't been a new law about immigration in over 40 years. And so both parties have been sort of kicking the can down the road. And this time Biden and Kamala Harris got blamed for immigration. And, but it's been delayed and delayed and delayed for a long time. And it's time to, if you're going to come to America legally, it's going to take at least 5 or 6 years. And if your family's starving or you're in fear for your life, 5 years seems like a pretty long time. And so it's probably, my guess is it's time to change the immigration laws and streamline the process for immigrants. But it's very much a hot button issue, and it's related to what's going on in Ireland now, and the whole Brexit. Leaving the European Union was all fueled by anti-immigrant sentiment. But I'm like you, Mike. I grew up in Chicago, where I was when I remember when I was a kid, there were hardly any Mexican restaurants in Albany Park, and now they're everywhere. And to me, I just think the world would be very, very boring if it was all this. America would be really boring if it was all homogenous. And in this case, for me, it just means I think of it as great food and great music.
I love that we have different people from different places, and I that's still what moves me a lot, is the kind of a rainbow coalition moving forward. Russ, I want to thank you for coming on. It's been great. People, just so you know, Russ will be in town on Friday, the 6th of December at the what's it called? The Cellar.
Yeah, the Book Cellar.
On Lincoln Avenue in Lincoln Square. And then he's going to be at Seminary Co-op with Bill Ayers on the 11th, and that is a Wednesday night.